Excuse me, Rabbi, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. I'll have to re-edit that out of the final version. So we're holding here the end of Perek Alef, the end of chapter 1 of Mesechta Megillah, last page. The about 4 lines from the end of the chapter, the middle of the line, the words soif soif, at the end of the day. Some of you may remember Professor Block. He was a shliach in London, Ontario, in the university there for many years, many decades, starting from the 60s. It's a Siyum of Perek. So Professor Block, he came the first time to Lubavitch in the early 1950s, maybe 1953 or 1954. Then he left for a little while and came back again afterwards, like in the end, like later on in the 1950s. And he was brought to Lubavitch by Rabbi Zalman Posner, who was later on from Nashville. Ramosha knew Zalman Posner very well. So the first time that Professor Block came, and he was by a Fabringen of the Rebbe, the Rebbe called over Rabbi Zalman Posner during the Fabringen, and he told him something. And Professor Block, he was then single, he wasn't married then, but he could tell that the Rebbe was speaking about him. And he asked Rabbi Zalman Posner, what did the Rebbe tell you? And he didn't want to tell him what the Rebbe said. Only many decades later did he finally say what the Rebbe told him. The Rebbe told him, go tell this young man, Yitzchak Block, that soif at the Verna chassid. At the end of the day, you will become a chassid. So what is he pushing it off for? That's what happened. He left and eventually came back. Well, whenever Professor Block would say this story over, he would say it with his accent. He would say sof vet the Verna chassid. So sof at the end of the day, he will become a chassid. So he says, although he was a shliach for many decades, he says, the Rebbe promised me I'll become a chassid one day. I know it's going to happen. So the Gemara says, sof. We went through a calculation yesterday, helped by all the various math professionals, to figure out how Yaakov was in the house of love, in the house of Shem and Aver, in the yeshiva, learning Torah for 14 years. And those 14 years, he was not punished for. There were 22 years Yaakov was away from his father. Yes, plus 14 years that he was learning in yeshiva. 36 years he was away from his parents. He did not honor them. And out of those 36 years he was away, 14 years he was learning in yeshiva, and measure to measure he was punished. He was separated from his son Yosef for 22 years. Why not 36 years? Because the 14 years he was sitting and learning Torah were not counted against that, because learning Torah is greater than honoring your parents. So the Gemara asks, Yaakov was in Lavan's house for only 20 years, 7 years working for Leah, 7 years working for Rachel, another 6 years after Yosef was born. What's 7 plus 7 plus 6? 20. So for only 20 years, he was in the house of Lavan. So why was he mourning for Yosef for 22 years and not 20 years. So the Gemara answers, Elamishum dishtai be'orcha tartin shnin. After Yaakov left the house of Lavan, and at the end of Parshas Vayetze, Lavan chases after Yaakov, and he escapes unscathed. In the beginning of Parshas Vayishlach, Esav comes to attack Yaakov with 400 men, or 400 generals, who each had 400 men, and he's saved from that. He didn't go right away straight back to Beersheba to see his father Yitzchak. It took him 2 years. One who learns Chumash with Rashi over there knows the answer. What took him 2 years? But the Gemara says over here, Yaakov did not go back right away to his father Yitzchak, but rather it took him 2 years to come back. Where do we see that from? The Tanya we learned in a brisa, Yatsa me'aram neharayim uvoloi l'sukkos. Look at the pasuk inside, the verse inside. I'll just take a second to come on the screen. It says, after Esav returned to Seir, after Yaakov managed to escape unscathed from Esav, Yaakov traveled to Sukkos. That's the name of a city. Sukkah means a hut. Vayiven lo bayis, he built for himself a house. Ulemikneu asa sukkos, and for his livestock he built a hut, temporary dwelling. Al kain kara shem hamakim sukkos, and therefore the place is called Sukkos because of the huts that he built. So the Gemara learns over here that it wasn't just that he built for himself a permanent dwelling, a house, and for his livestock he built huts temporary, but rather it's talking about what he built for himself and for his flock. He built for himself a bayis, a house, and sukkahs, temporary huts. In the winter, when it's cold, he built himself a real house, a house with walls. In the summer, when they're taking care of their livestock, they're out in the fields. So he built himself temporary dwellings in the fields. That's called sukkahs, huts. So there's 2 seasons really in Israel: the rainy season and summer. And over here we have 4 seasons. Sometimes in Pittsburgh we'll have 4 seasons in one day. We'll have 90-degree weather, and then in the afternoon it will become snowing, and suddenly it'll be beautiful again. But in Israel you have 2 seasons: the rainy season and the dry season. In the rainy season, he built a permanent structure, a bayis. For the hot season, when they're taking care of their livestock in the field, he built sukkos, a hut. The Torah in this pasuk says bayis, house, which is one house, and sukkos means huts. So Yaakov built 2 huts and 1 house. So if he builds a hut, let's look at the Gemara inside. It says, Yatzim Aram Narayim, Yaakov left Aram Narayim. This is where Lavan was. Uvaloi l'Sukkos, and he came to the city of Sukkos. The Asa Sham Shmoina Aser Chodesh, he was there for 18 months. Shnemar, as it is written, the Yaakov Nasa Sukkos. So Yaakov traveled to the city of Sukkos. Vayiven Loi Bayis, and he built for himself a house. Asa sukkos, and for his livestock he built huts, and huts is plural, so you only need a hut for 6 months of the year. So how many months did he have a hut for? 6, but sukkos, twice he built huts, so twice 6 months, 12 months. And for himself he built a house. You only need a house for 6 months of the year. That's another 6 months. So what's 6 plus 6 plus 6? 18. So he was 18 months that he was traveling on the way. So it was 1 winter and 2 summers in 18 months. And then in the city of Bethel, he was another 6 additional months. later on, it says after Yaakov came to the city of Shechem, and he dwelled in the city. And later on, after the story of Shechem, when Dinah was abducted, after all that, he wasn't in Shechem for a very long time. Shimon and Levi killed all the people of Shechem. Yaakov wanted to settle down there, and Hashem said, told Yaakov, Kum alei Beiskel v'shev sham. Go to Beiskel and dwell there, and make a mizbeach for Hashem, who revealed himself to you when you ran away from Esav.
And where did Yaakov live? Where did Yaakov and his sons actually, their families live? When actually Hashem said, "Oh, okay, it's time to go down to Egypt."
That he was living in Beersheba then.
Oh, okay.
Oh, whatever. We got that. Beersheba, Hebron. He went and his final stop in Israel before going down was in Beersheba.
Are you aware of any Meforshim that connect? It says the Jewish people, if I'm not mistaken, left from Ramses to Sukkos. And is it a different city or a different country, or I'm just kind of curious.
So interesting. I don't know why it would have the same name. Maybe because it also had temporary dwellings. That Sukkos is in Mitzrayim. It's in Egypt, and this is Sukkos in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel. So it is two different places, two different countries. Probably it's called Sukkos because it also was temporary structures, temporary dwellings. So he was in the city for 6 months. He went between Shechem and Beiskel. And if you look right over here at the end of the pasuk, he was. He says he pitched his tents for a very long distance. I think to Elei Moira from Beiskel, and he went to Ephras. That's where Benjamin was born. This is all before he came to Yitzchak. He went to Migdal Eder. This all takes place during that last 6 months before seeing. So the story was Shechem, Migdal Eder, Rachel passing away, and buried in Beis Lechem, in Ephras, Beiskel. All this takes place throughout that last period of 6 months before Yitzchak and Yaakov are finally reunited. Finally, over here in Pasuk of Zion, at the end of 22 years, Yaakov comes back to Yitzchak, his father, in Kiryas Arba in Hebron, where Avram and Yitzchak lived. And then Yaakov settled in Hebron. From there, he went to Beersheba, to Hebron. There were times he was here and times that he was there. So from the Gemara, it says, Uve Beiskel, also Shushachadash, in the city of Beiskel, Yaakov lived for 6 months. V'hikriv zvachim, and he brought korbanos to Hashem. So altogether, you have 22 years. 20 years in the house of Lavan, plus another 2 years it took for Yaakov to make it back to his father Yitzchak. So altogether, there were 22 years that he was separated from his father, wherein he was not learning Torah. And commensurate to that, Yosef was separated from his father also for 22 years.
But the question is, why was he punished? I mean, he was said that by his mother also. Even with me, as far as why did you communicate with them? If you're hiding from the mafia, you don't want to communicate with people.
So when exactly was Yaakov not honoring his parents? At what point? His parents told him to get married, right? And he was listening to what they said the first 7 years.
Yeah.
And Rivka sent her wet nurse, Devorah, to tell Yaakov to come back home. At what point was Devorah sent? Some Mefarshim say Devorah was sent at the end of the first set of 7 years, after Yaakov married Leah. So he got married, now come back home. But he stayed longer, and he married Rachel, and he stayed longer to get his wages after Yosef was born. And the whole time took longer, and another 2 years till he came back home after meeting Esav. So not necessarily was he totally fulfilling the mitzvah of kibbut av v'eim at that point. That's what the one Mefarish says. Some Sofer asked that question, and he says, how do we know the 14 years that Yaakov was not punished for, or the 14 years that Yaakov was in the yeshiva of Shem and Eber.
Who asked the question?
Chassam Sofer.
Oh, the sub.
Yeah, the Rav of Pressburg. Maybe the 14 years he was not punished for were the 14 years that he was married, that he worked for Lavan in order to marry Rachel and Leah. And maybe he was punished for those 14 years that he was in the yeshiva of Shem and Eber. And then again, not punished for 14 years that he was working to marry Lavan, Leah and Rachel, working for Lavan. And then punished once again for the 6 years that he was working for his wages, plus 2 years of coming back home. So how do you know which 14 years it is? Because having children is even greater than kibbud av va'em, honoring your parents. If somebody is older and they want to get married and the parents say, no, we need you at home to help, you can't get married. It's a mitzvah to get married. You don't have to have kibbud av va'em in that detail. You get married even though your parents don't want you to.
Yeah, because it's a mitzvah of the Torah, just like if your parents tell you actually, if you don't keep Shabbos,
Right.
In that case, you don't listen to your parents.
So he answers that Yaakov could have got married. He could have done the mitzvah of having children, even if he would live in Eretz Yisrael. He didn't have to go to Haran for that, except for the fact that he had to run away from Esav. So he sort of caused it to himself by causing Esav to hate him and to trick him by tricking Esav. So he sort of caused it to himself. So that's the reason why he had a punishment, a learning Torah in the house of the yeshiva of Shem and Eber. That was something he cannot do anywhere else. Because learning Torah on the same quality, the same level of learning, like in yeshiva of Shem and Eber, he had to be there for that. He couldn't have been anywhere else. But getting married and having children, technically he could have done it near his parents. He didn't. The only reason he had to do it in Haran was because he sort of had to run away from Esav because he tricked Esav. So therefore, being as he's at Tzaddik, he received a punishment for that.
But he was fulfilling his mother's request.
Right, but maybe bring home Rachel and Leah. Why stay over there? He stayed there because he was scared of Esav. He's saying because the mother told him, "Go there till I send for you."
But didn't he have to fulfill the contract with Lavan that worked 7 years and 7 years?
Right. So
Did that too on him.
right, but that's already not part of Chassam Sofer says directly honoring his parents. That's a contract he made with Lavan. Married Leah and Rachel, work in Israel and send back the money to him or do something else. But you somehow find a way to honor your parents while you're having children.
When did Esav go to Seir?
Esav went to Seir. This is throughout the. Esav married the daughter of the king of Seir, one of his wives, and he sort of took over the place. He conquered Seir once he's there.
I always had the question, there's a pasuk that says that Yaakov and Esav could not live together because the flocks were too big, there wasn't enough pasture.
Right,
Yaakov didn't get his sheep until after he came back from Lavan.
right,
Esav was already in Seir.
right.
When did it happen that they lived together and that there wasn't enough
It says about Esav or says about Lot?
What?
It says about Esav also?
Abraham and Lot. That's them. But also it says our Esav and Yaakov.
So you're bringing up an interesting point. Question is, why did Yaakov, once Yaakov was going back to his father, why did he take 2 years? What took him so long? He's already in the Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. Why did he take those extra 2 years to go back to his father, Yitzchak? He didn't want to see his father. Absence makes the heart grow even more fond. So the Medrash says that those entire 2 years that Yaakov didn't go to his father after he already came to Eretz Yisrael he was occupied with one thing. In the beginning of Parshas Vayishlach, Yaakov is trying to send a gift to Esav, his brother. And over, Yaakov is over and over trying to send his brother. And if you see over here, he sent 200 she-goats, 20 he-goats, 200 ewes, 20 rams, 30 nursing camels and their children, cows, bulls, donkeys, male donkeys. He gave Esav a very large gift. And Yaakov sees Esav coming. And Esav says, who are all these people and all these things that I saw? Yaakov says, I'm sending you a present. Please take my blessing, which I have given you. And the words in the pasuk are Vayitzer Bai, and Yaakov pressured Esav Vayikach, and he took it. So the Medrash Rabbah says that Esav did not take it right away. Esav told him, Hilach asher lach, my brother, I have a lot, I have plenty, keep whatever is yours. And Yaakov pressured him. So Yaakov kept on sending the present to Esav. It says every month, all the months that he was in Beis El, Yaakov kept on sending the present to Esav. And Esav kept on sending it back. And Yaakov did not feel safe to go to his father's house until Esav finally accepted the present. So that's what took so long. That's what took 2 years. So he kept on sending gifts and gifts to Esav. He was worried Esav might attack him a second time. So whether once, some say once a month, perhaps, or even maybe once a year. The Bar Tamura says that Yaakov was scared of coming too close to where Yitzchak lived because he was still scared of Esav. So he slowly started progressing closer and closer to Yitzchak, till after 2 years, he made incremental steps. He went to Shechem, he went to Migdal Eder, he went to Beis Lachem. Beis Lachem is closer to Hebron. So he's incrementally getting closer to Hebron to see how is Esav going to react. And he was ready to stay in Shechem, which is a little bit further north than Hebron, if not for the fact that Hashem told him, leave Shechem. So eventually, that's why it took so long till he got to Hebron, until he got to his father, Yitzchak, once again.
But Yaakov was constantly sending presents over to Esav, so hopefully, Yaakov had prime membership in Amazon. So that's where you start getting free shipping.
Yes, Yaakov had Amazon, right. Yaakov spent a lot of time in the Yeshiva Shem ve'Ever. The Megillah Shurim, the teachers there were prophets, Shem and Ever. A very high caliber student body. The budget was paid for by the Avos. They kept on giving Meiser to them. You see, Avram gave Meiser to Shem. So it was a very special, very high level yeshiva. Now, from where did Yaakov go to Egypt? So he was hiding in the house of Shem and Ever. Where was the yeshiva located of Shem and Ever?
I never thought of that.
You'll be very surprised. And if you look at Parshas Vayetze, if you look at right at the beginning of Parshas Vayetze, it says Vayetze Yaakov in Be'er Sheva, Vayelech Charana. Yaakov left Be'er Sheva and he went to Haran. So you would be excused if you would think to say that Yaakov went straight from Be'er Sheva straight to Haran. What we were learning till now is that Yaakov didn't go from Be'er Sheva to Haran. We learned in the pasuk before, it tells you about Nevoyas, the brother of Machlas, the son of Yishmael, married off his sister. And from there we learned that there's a 14-year gap, that Yaakov was learning in the yeshiva of Shem and Ever for 14 years. So it seems like he did not go straight from Be'er Sheva to Haran. He was in the yeshiva of Shem and Ever in the middle. It says in the Medrash that the order in the pasuk says Yaakov left Be'er Sheva and went to Haran, and then he happened upon the place of Har Moriah. It says that Yaakov left Eretz Yisrael, he went to Haran, and when he realized he didn't daven in Har Moriah, the place of the Beis HaMikdash, the place of Akedas Yitzchak, he turned around, he went back to Eretz Yisrael, and he stayed, and then he davened. He had a kvitzas haderech, he walked very quickly, and he made it to the Har Moriah, and he davened there. It says Har Moriah came to greet him in the place of Beis Kel, and Yaakov was ready afterwards to go back to Haran, and then Hashem made it get dark quickly, and he had to sleep over there. Today, if you go into Besel, it's right now in the Samaria, it's in the Shomron, it's in the settlements. It's here's a picture of it. They have over there every year a big concert, and they have area right outside the city, which they say this is a place where the Chalom Yaakov, the dream of Yaakov took place. I have a video of someone taking a tour there, but didn't bring it up here on the screen. But Beiskel, there's an area right outside the city. They say that's where Yaakov's dream was. Right now, there's a Jewish settlement over there, and they call it Bethel. So you're allowed to say the name of the city. And they say Yaakov's dream, this place was right there, and they have a place where Yaakov's camp was, where he lived. So he went from Haran back to Bethel, and then there he had his dream. So Marsha asked the question, the pasuk sounds like he went straight from Beersheba to Haran. What about being in the house? From what we know, he didn't go from Beersheba to Haran. He went from the house, yeshiva of Shem and Eber, yeshiva of Eber to Haran. Then he went back to Israel, and then he went from Bethel to Haran. So did he go from Beersheba? And it says, furthermore, Yaakov had a dream, and there's a ladder with malachim, with angels going up and down. It says that the base of the ladder was in Beersheba. The middle of the ladder was over Yerushalayim, the place of the Beis HaMikdash, and the top of the ladder was over Bethel, Beiskel. So that means, and Yaakov was sleeping not in Beersheba, because the base was in Beersheba, and he's sleeping by the top of the ladder. So rather, the Marsha says something very unique over here. You know where the yeshiva of Eber was? In Beersheba. So Yaakov never left Beersheba. Yaakov ran away from his father. Yaakov went to the yeshiva of Eber, which was in Beersheba, the same city where his father is living.
And this is said by the Marsha, right?
Yes.
He was my famous relative.
Oh, that's right. And they're also famous for having you as a relative.
Exactly.
So Yaakov went and hid in the same city where his father was, in Beersheba, in the yeshiva of Eber. But he couldn't visit his father and his mother for all those years. 14 years he's in Beersheba. And he couldn't visit his father and mother.
The clever, look at
And Marsha gives a few ramazim, a few different hints. He says the words Beersheba make up the words Ever, right? You have the words Ever, which was yeshiva of Ever.
Yeah.
And also the Beersheba are the letters of Arba Esrei, which is 14. So he was in the yeshiva of Ever for 14 years. In what city? In Beersheba. And although Yitzchak had a yeshiva, it says Yitzchak Zakim the Yoshev yeshiva. He was old and he had his own yeshiva. And Yitzchak was also in Beersheba. All three yeshivas were in Beersheba. Yeshiva of Shem, yeshiva of Ever, and the yeshiva of Yitzchak were all there in Beersheba. That was the center of Torah of those times.
Mm-hmm.
Although it says a person, a Talmid Chacham, a Torah scholar, cannot open a yeshiva in a place where another yeshiva already exists because it's competition. That's only if it's a colleague of his. But if it's a teacher, you are allowed to. A student's allowed to open up a yeshiva in the same place where their teacher is, because it says, a person is jealous of everyone else's success except for their children and their students. If your person's son is more successful than them, they're very proud of them. If a person's student or Talmud is more successful than them, they're also very proud of them. Shluchim, which they brought certain people back to Yiddishkeit, and they who also became shluchim and in many ways more successful than the original shliach, and they're very proud of them. They're not upset or jealous of them. Right? A person is not jealous of their students or of their children. So Yitzchak was a student of Shem and Ever. He's allowed to open up a yeshiva in the same city, in Beersheba. And there's a hint in this. It says, Vayetze Yaakov, the words over here, Mi Beersheba, from Beersheba. All those letters, Mem, Beis, Alef, Resh, Shin, Veis, Ayin, if you rearrange the letters, they make up the names Shem, Ever, right? Take the letters Mi Beersheba, Shem, Shin Mem, Ever is Ayin Veis Resh, and then Alef-Bais, which is Abraham, and Benoi, which is Yitzchak. So Mi Beersheba hints to you about the three yeshivas which were in the city of Beersheba. So I brought up here another tab. That's modern Beersheba. Where exactly is Beersheba? You have a modern city of Beersheba. It's the largest city in southern Israel, seventh to largest city in Israel. Nowadays, it's become the Silicon Valley of Israel. All the high-tech companies have all jumped into Beersheba. Place is booming. Became very expensive now. It's a new Chabad community, English-speaking Chabad community opened up now in Beersheba. By ancient Beersheba, you have two places. One is called Tel Sheva, the hill of Sheva. And people used to say this is where the old city was during a time of Avram and Yitzchak, which doesn't seem like a very large place. But then afterwards, people came to the conclusion this must be is a place in Nevi'im called Sheva. And rather, in the old city of Beersheba is another area, which over there they think that's where the ancient Beersheba is.
It'd be like if you have the old city of Jerusalem, new city, similarly Bnei Brak, modern Bnei Brak.
Correct.
It's like a little bit away from the old Bnei Brak, you know.
Right. Here is modern Beersheba, and then you have the Tel Sheva right next to it, the remains of the Sheva. So in this little place, small area, you could see that there was, and here's Beersheba, and somewhere in the middle of the city, you have the old city, somewhere in the center.
Maps.
No, this is pictures that people took. This is a website talking about all the places of Tanakh. I think over here, in this area over here, that's the old city of Beersheba with old ruins. It's where Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov lived, Shem and Eber, they all had their yeshivas in this place. Now to conclude, we concluded the Perek, Hadnalach and Megillah and Nekras. We will turn to you, Perek and Megillah and Nekras. Tomorrow we'll start the new Perek. I'll conclude just with an interesting explanation on this Gemara from the Ostrovtzer Rebbe. We brought up a little bit about him yesterday. This is his Oyhel.
He was killed in the Holocaust.
No, passed away in 1928.
1920.
His son took him over, was killed in the Holocaust. His son, I think, was named Rechiel Meir. He was killed in the Holocaust. From his parents were bakers. He did not come from any unique lineage, like a lineage of Rebbes or Tzaddikim. They're simple Jews. He would always, from a very young age, he was drawn to Chassidus, and from a very young age, he would not speak any extra words. He is a tremendous masmid, assiduous learner, and he started fasting from his 20s. He would fast every single day, and he would only at night, 6 days a week, all he would eat was a cup of warm milk and biscuits. End of his life, he was so weak, he became very cold. He had to be constantly covered by blankets. They said that he foresaw the Holocaust would come, and that's what we finished off yesterday. And that's why he was fasting every day, trying to take away the decree. That's what what's a picture of him? That's what he was. Rechiel Michal of Ostrovtzer. He had many, many Talmidim. Sometimes different tzaddikim, the Sfas Emes, a Rebbe, they would ask him, or they would tell him, it's not good to fast so much, you can't afflict your body. Tell him what the Maggid of Mizrich said, that a small hole in the body is a big hole in the Neshama. And he would always answer with metaphors very quickly. He says, your parents were big tzaddikim. You came from the Sfas Emes, the Imrei Emes, you're from Kotzker Rebbe's Talmidim. My parents were bakers. So you have the schus of your parents. They fasted for you. I have to make up everything my parents didn't do. I would ask him, why are you fasting so much? And he would say, my father taught me that bread is best when it's warm, and you should always keep your mouth closed. So I keep my mouth closed. I don't let in food, and I don't talk. What?
How old did he live?
He was age of 77. But one last thing I forgot to mention, once you're mentioning Sfas Emes writes, and this could explain a lot why he wasn't punished for those 14 years. It says, before Yaakov left Beersheba, the yeshiva of Shem and Eber, the yeshiva of Eber, to go to Haran, he secretly visited his parents again. visited Yitzchak and Rivka again without Esav knowing about it. So the Torah doesn't mention him going to visit his parents again, just like the Torah doesn't mention he was in the house of Aver in the yeshiva of Aver for 14 years, because it was all, the Torah is telling you how all this was secretive, was quiet. He didn't want Esav to find out about it. But he said, the Sfas Emes says that he did visit his parents one last time before going to Haran. Because he was right there, he's leaving the yeshiva of Aver to go to Haran.
I mean, actually thought of something actually that if all else failed, is you could have as an answer, but I mean others almost actually did not fail when you get to come with different calculations, but I think actually it's like worst comes to worst, you could say actually that if you were actually deprived of a mitzvah, even though it may not be your fault, but it has an effect. So therefore, you could say we had to actually go through a punishment, in order to actually make up for it. In others, actually, like the blemish had to be removed. But I mean, but we didn't have to say that because we managed to come up with explanations. But if we wouldn't have been able to. That would have been my best thought.
So one time he was asked why he fasts so much. He said his father taught him that the tighter the oven is closed, the more heat it maintains. The tighter it keeps his mouth shut, the more heat, the better off he will be. And he was a very big Talmud Chacham. He had many students, many thousands. He had a yeshiva, many thousands of Bachrim, which he taught, in many Nigunim, which he taught. So on this Gemara, he says a very interesting thing about his whole story of Yaakov and Esav, of Yaakov running away from Esav and Yaakov mourning 22 years. He says Yaakov, out of the 22 years that he was away from his parents, that he was punished for, 14 years we already know he was not punished for at all. But even of those 22 years, the first 7 years and the second 7 years, which is 14 years, Yaakov was working in order to work for a wife, to work for Rachel and Leah, and therefore he was listening to his parents' instructions. So that's the first 14 years. So the first 14 years, he was still listening to his parents. It wasn't, you could say, it wasn't the same way as the next 8 years where he already was married. The last 6 years he was by Laban, and the 2 years that he's going back to Eretz Yisrael, going back to his father, Yitzchak. There, you could say he had no reason, the reason of Kibbut of Aim, listening to his parents, doing their instructions, cannot be used. Saying that I'm listening to my parents by not being around them. Even of those last 8 years, the 6 years that he was by working for Lavan to get his wages, then every 2 years he started traveling back, and it took 2 years to go from Haran back to Yitzchak. That he was going from place to place. But even during those 2 years, he was in one direction, traveling towards Yitzchak. He was longing and he was going in a direction toward Yitzchak. So those years weren't as difficult for him as those previous 6 years where he was not working for Lavan in order to get married, so not honoring his parents. And he already had a longing, he's going in the direction towards Yitzchak. Yosef was very similar. It says Yosef, those 22 years of Yosef that he was separate from his father were equivalent to the 22 years that Yaakov was separated from Yitzchak. So when Yosef was in Egypt, said the first year he was a slave, he was working for Potiphar, but Potiphar put him in charge of his house. Then he's put into prison for 12 years. And prison was no vacation. It was very difficult, very hard times. Then he became viceroy of Mitzrayim, viceroy of Egypt. And first he was king during the 7 years of plenty, but he wasn't doing anything. But now he had the opportunity. Okay, we're going to finish in a minute. I guess he wasn't charging properly. Now he had the opportunity to go to his parents, but he didn't. So it's considered as if he's neglecting kibbut avim. And then you had the 2 years of famine. And during those 2 years of famine, until Yaakov came down, Yaakov already had a sense. It says Yaakov saw that there was food in Egypt. Rashi says there is hope in Mitzrayim. Perhaps his son Yosef, he sensed already that his son Yosef is alive. So you had 1 year that he's in charge of Potiphar's house, where it was a good life. Then you had 12 years in prison where it was not good. Once again, you had 7 years where it was good. 7 years where it was not good. But and the last 2 years, he also had a good life for 7 years. And 2 years of famine, those 2 years of famine were famine, but it was already, you could say, the beginning of the stage being set. The brothers coming to Mitzrayim and the reuniting of Yaakov and Yosef. So you have the same exact thing. Just like Yaakov, out of the 22 years, 14 years were years where he was partly honoring his parents, and the 8 years he was not honoring his parents. 6 years was totally not honoring, but 2 years was heading towards his parents, partly honoring his parents. It's not as hard. And Yosef had the same exact thing. He had 14 years when it was good for him as a slave, because he had 1 year in the house of Potiphar, 7 years as a king. But again, he had 14. If he had 12 years being in prison, we had 12 years being in prison, 2 years as being in the years of hunger. But even those 2 years of hunger was already the beginning of the steps of the reunification between Yaakov and Yosef. Same way, you had 14 years and 8 years, and in 8 years divided into 6 and 2 by Yaakov. Same way you had it by Yosef. So the Ostrovtzer Rebbe says how everything we see, every single thing that happens to our parents has an effect in how it turns out and affects our children. And you see every single thing in Torah is very, very exact. And just to conclude the last 5 minutes, or until the battery decides to go.
You said that everything that happens to us, to our parents.
Their parents. What happened to Yaakov and Yitzchak happened in turn to Yosef and Yaakov. Right? It's the same breakup of 22 years, 14 years, 6 years, and 2 years.